The First Punic War was a massive strategic struggle. There's urban sieges, land battles, and monumental naval clashes. One of the best ways to think about the First Punic War is as a circumnavigation of Sicily. It began in 264 BC, more or less, at Messana in the northeast, and it moves clockwise around the island until it ends 20-odd years later in 241 BCE off the coast of Drepana, which is today Trapani, in the northwest of Sicily. Over more than 2 decades, there are epic triumphs and defeats for both sides, but also long periods of stalemate where there's virtually no action. Several of the most significant battles come right at the beginning. The war's second year saw the Roman Senate coming to the decision to fill Sicily with the combined forces of their 2 consular armies. These armies added up to a total of almost 40,000 soldiers. So this decision, more than anything else, illustrates Rome's big ambitions. In other words, once they committed to the conflict, the Romans were moving to keep the island into their own sphere of influence. The sheer enormity of the Roman army quickly convinced several cities to immediately declare for Rome, including Syracuse, who abandoned their erstwhile allies, the Carthaginians, believing Rome would have the upper hand in the conflict to come. The Romans then set their sights on Agriccas, today's Agrigento. This was a prominent Greek-founded city on Sicily's rugged south coast that the Carthaginians had taken some decades previously. Carthage's allied cities in the west of Sicily were Phoenician-speaking originally, like Carthage, and culturally linked to the city itself. And when you look at the map, you can see the reason why. Prevailing currents and winds means there's an almost direct sea route from the south coast of Sicily to the North African coast. Agrigento was seen as a buffer between the east and the west of Sicily, the Greeks in the east and the Carthaginian zones of influence in the west. The arrival of both Syracusan and Roman armies left the Carthaginian garrison in the city overwhelmed by the looming threat of their collective power. Carthage did send an army to reinforce the city, made up of Celts and Ligurians and Iberians. But this is a telling moment as you really get the feeling that Carthage found itself in a war it was completely unprepared to fight. Carthage, like most Hellenistic states, often recruited mercenaries for its overseas fighting, while using their own citizens to defend home territory and to crew their navies. Ancient sources have tended to exaggerate the impacts that this had, but it's true that Carthage's armies were seen as their weakest point. The bulk of their armies consisted of men from their allies in North Africa and Iberia, supplemented by soldiers for hire from across the Mediterranean. Because we have to understand that soldiering was a profession in the ancient world. And to work for Carthage could be lucrative, as they were known for their high rates of pay. But raising an army was slow, and this was a quick and unexpected attack. So it took time for the Carthaginians to reinforce their garrison in the besieged city. Agrigento was a big ancient city, and the Roman blockade had trapped almost 50,000 people within the walls. The Romans also disrupted the harvest, which meant there was little food for the city's inhabitants. Famine came soon after the siege and only added to people's troubles. When Carthage's new army arrived, it surrounded the Roman troops. The Carthaginian commander, Hanno, was conscious of the desperate situation within the city and pressed battle with the Romans quickly to try to relieve the population. So we're told that it was a very close fight, but in the end, the Romans came out as victors and forced the Carthaginian army to retreat to the nearby city of Heraclea. So after a 5-month-long siege, the Carthaginian commander at Agrigento chanced an evacuation of his garrison. His actions spared his soldiers, but left the city's populace without any protection. Rome's troops stormed and sacked the city, and many of its people were enslaved. The spoils of their victory were sent to Rome and paraded through the streets. The people who had been enslaved were paraded as well, and the statues and gold from the city that was soon to be renamed Agrigentum in its Latin name. According to Polybius, the Roman people were astonished and delighted by the riches that were looted from this Sicilian city. And soon the whole of the Roman population were heartily in support of the war for the whole island. Now, this is a really important part of the story because two key theories of Rome's rise to world domination are prevalent in scholarship. And it's really important for this period to understand. One explanation, and the one that the Romans liked to put forward, was that they had won their empire just by accident. They were just accidental imperialists. They happened to be so good at conquest and ruling, while their enemies were so perfidious and foolish that the empire just fell into their hands. The other explanation is that the Romans were the most bloodthirsty and savage barbarian conquerors that the Hellenistic world had ever seen, and it couldn't cope with their single-minded determination. I think the reality lies somewhere in the middle. All sides were fighting for the sake of advancement. In Rome's case, their consistent successes in expanding throughout Italy over the previous century had really brought about their zeal for conquest, as well as the economic boost that constant warfare was providing them. This was embodied in their politics, where competition amongst elite families drove further expansion to such an extent that there was never an alternative. It was just how the Roman system was. The Romans did have a different attitude from the beginning, though. Their ruling class gained wealth and power from conquest. It was a key part of elite male identity in Rome, to be a general who fought and conquered. Indeed, the elite competed amongst themselves to outdo each other on the battlefield. Subsequently, the Roman Senate usually eschewed peace negotiations and settled for nothing less than total victory. So the result was a snowball effect when it came to wars, which tended to escalate dramatically in Roman hands. We know so much less about the Carthaginian system and its traditions that it's difficult to analyze their intentions. They had inherited an advanced naval prowess and culture thanks to their location on the sea and seafaring Phoenician ancestors. The city's influence relied heavily on the sea, making ships Carthage's primary form of communication with allied cities. This would explain why a great deal of the state's fortunes appear to have come from naval trade, as well as their overall control of ports and duties that came as well. As a result, Carthage gained a reputation that highlighted their naval superiority, but this is often overstated because Carthage was much more than just a naval city. It sat on Africa's north coast in a wealthy and prosperous part of the world with rich agricultural resources. Its wine was celebrated, its agricultural technology studied around the Mediterranean. Nevertheless, the way the Carthaginians perceived themselves had a lot to do with the sea and how their citizens managed their navy. Whether it was the manufacturing of ships, the mechanisms of the ports, or the level of seamanship from the sailors, the Carthaginian naval culture touched all levels of the population. If we look at the naval exploits and number of ships employed by the Carthaginians in the 3rd century BC alone, it's very likely that the needs of the navy could not have been met by citizens or just allies. And mercenaries and slaves would also have needed to have been employed on their warships. This is equally true of the Romans. There are indications that Carthage's navy was enhanced further by privately sponsored naval organizations as well. This means that citizens would build an outfit and manage ships for specialized operations. For instance, in 250 BC, a man who was known as Hannibal the Rhodian, an admiral of Carthage, and his exceptional crew managed to successfully avoid a blockade set by the Romans in the city of Lilybaeum, which is today's Marsala in Sicily. We're told that the Rhodian had fitted the ships personally. Now, modern Marsala also provides us with some wonderful evidence of Carthaginian shipbuilding prowess in this period. There were 2 Punic ships found off the coast of Sicily in the early 1970s, excavated by the pioneering underwater archaeologist Honor Frost. One is called a Liburnian, which is a small galley ship used for raiding and patrols, and it was likely sunk by force at some point near the end of the First Punic War. It's an incredible find, and it's on display today in the Maritime Museum in Marsala. And it's provided us with a wealth of information about the construction and the building techniques used by the shipwrights of Carthage. So the preservation of calligraphy on this ship in the Phoenician Punic script is amazing and indicates there was a kind of prefabrication with the separate parts of that ship. And each part was lettered to allow for a portable construction. On the other hand, Polybius tells us the Romans had virtually no experience with naval warfare at the outbreak of the First Punic War. At the moment they crossed to Sicily, we're told they had to borrow decked ships and warships from their allies. This may well be a prime example of how the ancient sources from this time tend to massage the story of the wars with Carthage. Numerous scholars have challenged the idea that Rome had no naval experience at the outset of the war. They very likely had at least some. And of course, their new allies, like the Syracusans, were important naval powers. But it's this heroic narrative for Polybius and later historians to portray the Romans as the underdogs, who through their cleverness and adaptability beat the aggressors at their own game. Whatever the case, by the time the first big naval battle of the First Punic War took place off of Mylae, which is today's Milazzo, in the year 260 BC, it seems the Romans had managed to construct a navy and train competent soldiers and captains. The Romans, we are told, had based the construction of their navy on a captured Carthaginian ship. They had, however, made an important adaptation. And this was something that's called the corvus, which means crow in English. And it's a kind of retractable boarding bridge that was attached to the prow of a ship. The corvus was rigged to the front of the Roman ship and could swing around and drop onto the attacking ship by means of a rope. It was about 4 feet wide and 36 feet long, and it had a spike that would allow it to attach to the deck of an enemy ship. So by locking the hulls together, the Roman Marines could then fight their way across on the corvus and kill or capture the enemy crew. Now, this changed the dynamics of naval warfare, which until this point were all about ramming and sinking enemy ships. But the Romans now had a way to use their superior troops to their advantage at sea. Now, even the mightiest Carthaginian ship could be captured if the Roman Marines got close enough to board it. It seems to have made all the difference at the Battle of Mylae. Despite the Carthaginian seamanship and naval pedigree, they were thoroughly defeated, with many dozens of their ships captured with this new Roman tactic. And in fact, what was counterintuitive about the First Punic War was that the Carthaginian performance at sea continued to be pretty abysmal. Historians have perhaps not only then maybe exaggerated Roman inexperience at the start of the war, but we might consider that they overstated military prowess of Carthage's navy too. And we might want to think about the Carthaginian navy more as a kind of merchant marine in origin. Yet despite successes at sea, the situation in Sicily ground down to a long war of attrition. The island's mountainous and has traditionally favored defenders. Though the Romans had captured Agrigento, further advances through Sicily were difficult, with sieges spanning years, and there was limited ability to bring the full force of the Roman army to bear on the entrenched Carthaginian positions. Decisive naval battles also eluded the Romans, with the skilled Carthaginian fleets after Mylae knowing to avoid total capture so they could continue to harass Roman shipping and transport fleets. The war had been dragging on for nearly a decade when the Romans decided in 256 BCE to change their strategy and send a fleet to invade North Africa directly. The Carthaginians recognized this as a big impending threat and responded. And what resulted is possibly the largest naval battle in history, with somewhere between 400 and 700 ships involved. Remember, this is an era where rowing provides the main power and maneuverability for ships. The upper end of this estimate means there could have been as many as 100,000 rowers, marines, and sailors involved in the engagement. Now, these are outrageous numbers. The entire population of Rome might only have been around 250,000 in this time frame. Same with Carthage. So it means both sides were committing huge amounts of resources, and human and material, to this conflict. All indications suggest that the battle, which took place off of a place called Cape Ecnomus, was closely fought, but ultimately the Carthaginians lost it and now faced a full-scale invasion of their home territory. The Roman consul in charge of the invasion was a man named Marcus Attilius Regulus, and he landed more than 15,000 soldiers on Carthaginian soil and began marching towards Carthage itself. Several towns and cities fell to the Romans, including Tunis, which is modern Tunis, just 10 miles from the capital. Obviously, Carthage is facing a desperate situation. They attempt to recall their forces from Sicily to protect the homeland, but with the fall of Tunis, they sue for peace with the Romans. Yet Regulus's terms are so outrageous and harsh that Carthage has little choice but to fight on. The war has taken a huge toll on Carthage by this point. We can see this in the archaeological site of Kerkouane especially clearly. This is a small town on the north coast of Africa that got its wealth in the ancient world through the production of a unique and highly valued purple dye. If its dye didn't make it special enough, in modern times, Kerkouane is among the few fully Punic sites to have been unearthed. This matters because this tiny city offers us a close look into the everyday urban life and standard of living that came with it during Carthage's rule in North Africa. For this town, which subsisted as well on fishing and agriculture, those standards are particularly high. The inhabitants of Kerkouane were incredibly organized and resided in small, well-built homes. Many of these homes had floors lined with mosaics, and this is pretty extraordinary in the 3rd century BC, and had indoor plumbing, extra extraordinary for the time. This was very much an all-mod cons kind of place. Yet it seems that Regulus's invasion directly led to the total desertion of this small city. Those of the population who weren't amongst the 20,000 taken back to Rome as captives to be sold in slavery, anyone left moved away. Despite its grisly fate, it remains a stunning location and offers anybody who bothers to visit it a glimpse of the invasion and the ruin it brought upon a thriving Punic town. We see the evidence of the devastation as well in the currency of Carthage. From the mid-250s BCE, we see consistent debasement in the silver quantity, and the Carthaginian shekels and its bi-shekels are much less valuable than they were at the start of the war. Now, this is a clear sign that the economy is in decline. They are desperately minting coins without the precious metal content to back them up, to try to keep paying their armies. Facing total annihilation, the Carthaginians turned to a Spartan named Xanthippus to reform and defend their capital against the Romans. The Carthaginian army that we think about when we think about Hannibal begins now. Xanthippus reorganized the army and sought to better deploy the biggest advantages the Carthaginians had against the Romans. These were their fast and hard-hitting cavalry and their elephants, which they had just begun to experiment with after Pyrrhus had first used them in the Western Mediterranean. Xanthippus puts these two elements at the heart of the Carthaginian battle strategy and sought open plains on which to use them to the fullest advantage against the Romans. At the Battle of Tunis in 255 BCE, Xanthippus's reorganized army is put to the test. Results are devastating for the Romans. The Roman infantry had no answer to the elephants, now deployed at the front of the Carthaginian lines, who stampede through the Roman ranks and caused confusion across the battlefield. The Carthaginian cavalry is then able to sweep in and outflank the Roman lines, weakening them so the Carthaginian infantry moves in to finish the job. Now, this is one of the few Carthaginian field victories in the First Punic War, but it was a critical one. Nearly all of the 15,000 Roman troops of Regulus's invasions are wiped out, we're told. A huge Roman fleet is sent back to evacuate the survivors and to stabilize the situation. But upon returning to Sicily, it was wrecked before it reached the island in a storm. And it's reported that 384 ships were sunk and tens of thousands of men lost at sea. It's an almost inconceivable naval disaster by today's standards, and certainly an exaggeration. This does emphasize, though, just how dangerous seagoing was in this period. And ironically, it may have been that corvus that made Roman ships particularly unseaworthy, leaving them vulnerable to capsize in rough weather. So Carthage had survived total defeat, but only just. The war is far from over. The economic toll on both sides was epic, and neither wants to capitulate. In these later stages of the war, the Romans abandon the idea of the outright capture of Carthage, and the focus shifts back to Sicily, and particularly its western coast. Here were the traditionally Carthaginian allied cities of Panormus, Drepana, and Lilybaeum, which the Romans now had in their crosshairs. The defense of the west of Sicily in 247 BCE would fall to a young commander and scion of one of Carthage's military elite families, whose name was Hamilcar Barca. He is sent to take command in Sicily with just a handful of ships and troops, with the goal of holding the Romans off at all costs. In that very same year, with the fate of Carthage on a knife's edge, Hamilcar's son, Hannibal Barca, is born in Carthage.